then when I'd come back and gone through junior high school, in high school I was a skater pretty heavily, so I was into a lot of punk rock and things like that, and SST records, and then one of the kind of more obscure, quirky bands on that label was called the Minutemen, and they had a bass player named Mike Watt, who was a huge influence on me in terms of his creativity and just the angular, cartoonistic nature of his bass playing, which would carry me into some of my favorite jazz later. So I kind of got obsessed with playing bass from those guys and listening to Paul McCartney and the Beatles, and as I was trying to become a bass player, I just randomly read this obituary in Guitar Player magazine. This was like 1987, and there was this guy named Jaco Pastorius that had passed, and he sounded really interesting to me, and so I rifled through. I ascertained that he had played with, or surmised rather, that he'd played with Joni Mitchell on a bunch of her records, and I realized, of course, that those records were probably in my stepmom's collection. So I rifled through those, and sure as hell, there were like 3 or 4 records that he was on. So I dropped like the needle onto this record, Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, and the fretless bass. Like, I mean, it was just so revelatory because it's really unparalleled, magical bass playing. And I'm sure a lot of bass players would agree with this, and I really don't consider myself much of a bass player anymore, but I certainly was at that time. But it ruined my life. I mean, I was obsessed from that moment on. I just wanted to do everything just like Jaco, which that's what happens to bass players when they hear him. It's a real curse. That's the effect, and that's how singularly important he was. So yeah, that bass playing just blew me away, and then I was obsessed with Weather Report, and basically I sought out everything he'd done. And mind you, this is still when I was self-taught, before I'd really figured out, like, my friends going to college and all that stuff. But so I just started trying to copy by ear everything that I heard him play, you know. And I had quick ears. I'd always had quick ears, so without really knowing the theory behind it, I was just basically kind of by rote learning, you know, these parts. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Blessing, curse, I don't know. He was a great writer and bassist.
Can you talk about how you're influenced by Sean Lane and how that played into your whole story?
This backtracks to around like 5th or 6th grade. Well, you know, really important to my father's career. I know all these questions go back and are long, but they all have to be prefaced.
Yeah.
My father married my stepmom in 1980, and they had a band that was, as Memphis bands go, kind of had a good run at it. They were signed to RCA Records, and they were called The Breaks, and they were sort of a early 80s rock, new wave, you know, one of those bands that kind of sounded like like Patti Smith and Scandal, Smythe, whatever, or like the Motels, or some of those bands. They had a video like on MTV and toured around, and I mean, you know, I remember seeing them being interviewed by Martha Quinn. I was out of town somewhere, and so I was blown away. But so they had a good run at it, but nevertheless, they were probably one of the more popular bands in the early 80s. And the rhythm section for that band, basically, as labels often will do, because my stepmom was an attractive vocalist and a strong front woman, the labels basically kind of broke that band up, you know, because they wanted to focus on her. And that rhythm section, which was Rob Cottle, Russ Cottle, and a keyboardist named Tom Ward, went on and formed kind of a bar band that played a lot around Memphis, and they were called the Willies. And that band's guitar player was Sean Lane. And if nobody else has stated his story, Sean, you know, was a extreme virtuoso from an early age, who had played with Black Oak Arkansas in Coliseums and stuff when he was like 14 or 15. Just the most prodigious, fast electric guitar player alive. Certainly as people know him, although he was a genius composer and melodicist and pianist and drummer and bassist as well. But my dad, you know, was friends with Sean, and he knew that I would just flip out, so he took me to see him a few times when I was probably in 6th grade, and it just blew my mind. And I met Sean. So I recall, like, he shook my hand through a handkerchief. Sean had a series of years where he was really phobic about germs and stuff. And then, you know, the legend of Sean can be Googled and learned about, but the record that he had that was on Warner Brothers called Powers of 10 at that time was a cassette that was like kind of floating around Memphis, and my dad had a copy of that, so I just wore that out like night and day listening to it, and that stuff soaked in. And although I've had long periods of time as a professional bassist or drummer, the thing that I mainly have done for the past few years, and really in terms of putting out my records and being a songwriter, and really since I was a little kid, like the main thing in my own sense of self that I do is, you know, play guitar. Rock and roll guitar, kind of shredder guitar sometimes, but basically just rough and tumble raw guitar and guitar solos. I mean, it's also worth noting, sorry to be so sidetracked, but in 7th grade, the whole bass player thing was going on, but I was really obsessed with Led Zeppelin 1 and 2 and all the Jimi Hendrix records, and that's what I was sitting in my bedroom doing, was learning like all these guitar solos and guitar parts, and those were my jams. And listening to Sean, but the Sean stuff, all the speed stuff was way over my head, but like all the harmonic content got in there in a sense of melodicism, and also his tone, which was really pure and clean and smooth.